jobs just weren't that plentiful in flying.
It has been said that whatever impedes a man and doesn't stop him aids his progress. I'm inclined to believe that Piedmont's progress has been largely the result of the fantastic achievements and experience of the Piedmont people, all of our employees, and the support of many steadfast friends during that trying experience.
Tom was the kind of leader that people were willing to come back and work for him after the war, even though they had better offers from bigger companies. He was just that kind of infectious personality and that kind of great leader.
He was interested in that airline, and especially the people. He's the one person that I've ever known or met that could walk into a station and call an agent by name. He would spend time talking to an agent or a baggage man or anybody, and you had a problem, you could always go to his office and he would see you. And that feeling just grew over the whole airline.
But he also was very sharp and very demanding. He read every piece of correspondence. He instilled in his workforce the need to be thrifty, the need to do things right, the need to take care of the customer. And that helped Piedmont greatly.
Tom Davis was famous for his tightness with the budget, and he had to be. You know, they said sometimes he would even count the number of pencils that a station had, using every single bit of material, not ordering anything that was unnecessary.
He would reuse paper clips, reuse envelopes, or scratch pads of paper instead of just have little stuff all around. Instead of going out and getting some fancy new stationery or something, we use the back of envelopes or anything. Just make do with what you have, and the more we can use and the more dollars we can save is for better equipment we can buy for the passengers. We just really need to make do with what we have and watch the pennies, watch the pennies.
As he struggled to make an airline a reality, the leadership of Tom Davis would be tested. In order to launch this new division of Piedmont Aviation, he needed capital to buy planes along with everything else the new operation required. Offering 675,000 shares of stock in the company that were quickly purchased, Mr. Davis was able to fund the startup of Piedmont Airlines. In order to identify itself, Piedmont Aviation adopted a logo presenting its two divisions. The top circle represented the General Aviation Division, the same group that had operated the CPT program during the war, sold airplanes and parts, as well as flew charter flights. Added to that was the airline with its own circle. As part of the design came an emblem to demonstrate the pace of Piedmont. Modified somewhat over the years, it gained the nickname of Speedbird and became the embodiment of the energy and focus of a company ready to grow and prosper. But the fight with state airlines over government authorization persisted, keeping Piedmont Airlines on the ground throughout 1947. By early the following year, Tom Davis received word of a temporary okay to fly while the lawsuit wound its way through the court system. Anxious to begin, the winter of 1948 presented more problems. Weather in eastern North Carolina was the worst it had been in decades. But by mid-February, skies began to clear for the first flight. Inauguration of a regular route that started in Wilmington, North Carolina, and stop by stop made its way across the Appalachian Mountains to Cincinnati, Ohio. Finally, a date was set. Piedmont Airlines would take off on February 20th, 1948. The captain of that first flight was Leon Fox.
It was quite a nice day. It was a little chilly, as I remember. We left Wilmington, and our first stop was in Pinehurst.
It was to go from Wilmington to Cincinnati with several stops. Charlotte was one of the stops, Asheville. It created some excitement along the way, and Piedmont only had 3 DC-3s and 250 employees, so it was a very small airline, but it was the beginning. It just kept working.
A week after the inaugural trip came another, launching service from New Bern, North Carolina to Louisville, Kentucky. This time the route ran through Winston-Salem, where the company celebrated its grand opening. The festivities included ceremonies attended by North Carolina Governor Greg Cherry and Charlie Norfleet, the man who connected Tom Davis to his aviation company.
I think that all the people with Piedmont, Charlie Norfleet meant more to him than anybody else around, because he was on the airport committee, and Tom particularly respected him and listened to him and took his advice on things. He was a great help. And a nice guy along with him.
Piedmont Airlines quickly began regularly scheduled passenger service from towns and cities of North Carolina and Virginia to the Ohio Valley. Passenger counts grew slowly to ride Tom Davis's air bridge across the mountains.
Danville, for instance, you could fly in there, you might pick up 1 or 2 passengers, and you might not pick up any.
They weren't making a great amount of money, but they made a little bit of money. And part of this was they had some postal routes, and that was their cash flow as they were building up their customer base. But as they established a reputation for customer service and for promptness and staying on schedule, people started flying Piedmont, and their passenger counts steadily grew throughout the late 40s and throughout the 1950s. Every year they were flying more passengers than the previous year, and they were doing better and better.
People were beginning to travel more. They were beginning to understand that there were worlds outside the small communities that they lived in, and aviation certainly made that possible. But more importantly, with Piedmont, it served all of the smaller communities that major airlines like an Eastern or a Delta would not have come to.
Piedmont started very small, and in the early years did not do much advertising for additional staff. When they needed more staff, Tom Davis would ask his employees, you know, do y'all have some friends? Do you know some people that would be good to work for Piedmont? And then there were other ways that folks were recruited. Now, in Roanoke, for example, about that time, the station manager in Roanoke went down to buy a new suit one day in downtown Roanoke, and he met a young fellow there named Bob Reed, and Bob Reed was just barely out of high school.
We talked for a while, and I told him about being around the airport, and come to find out he was the manager for Piedmont Airlines. And I knew Piedmont name because I had seen the airplanes at the airport. And he came back the next day, and we talked a little bit more, and he said, how would you like to go to work for Piedmont? And I said, man, that'd be great. And I said, but I'm not 21. He said, that doesn't make any difference. So I said, well, yeah, when would you want me to start? And he said, how about tomorrow? And I said, no, I can't do that. I've got to give these people here some notice. So I gave them notice and went to work for Piedmont on May 28th, 1950.
That's just one of the ways that people ended up in Piedmont, person to person.
Some of the flight attendants ended up becoming pilots. People who started off sweeping floors in the maintenance shop ended up as vice presidents of the company. If you had initiative and you were a good worker, and you were willing to take responsibility for your actions, you had a future at Piedmont.
You know, you're young and your mind is much like a sponge. You know, it's going to absorb everything, and you were looking forward to learning as much as you could. But I think I was not unlike a lot of my friends and former colleagues, that we tried to absorb as much about the airline as we could, even though things were not in our responsibility, like maintenance was not in my area of responsibility. But I wanted to know more about how these airplanes worked.
I made a total of 90 cents an hour as a licensed mechanic. While I was doing that, I was also getting my commercial pilot's license. So after work, I would take flight training for a commercial license. We all knew each other real well back then, so I just went over to Mr. Davis after work one day and said, I'd like to get on as an airline pilot. He looked at me and he said, we can't get along without you over there in the engine shop because we need you over there. And I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say anything. I just looked at him and he said, no, I think we can work it out if you really want to.
Made $225 a month and $3.75 a day for meal expenses. And if you flew past midnight, you got an extra $1 for a midnight snack. It was tough. It was tough. After, I guess, maybe 6 months of that, you're going to ride these things, you might as well drive them. You'd have a lot of empty legs sometimes, like we'd fly a trip out of Washington, went down to Asheville, and was a turnaround, and you come back up to Washington, stop Tri-Cities, Roanoke, Lynchburg, Charlottesville. Well, on the empty leg, the guys would bring me up there and let me fly. So I'd, you know, get 30 minutes here, an hour there, stuff like that. And the bug bit me, and I bought me an airplane, and the guys taught me how to fly it. Then when I got my hours built up, they hired me.
Normally, a person that's a good employee with you will bring in somebody that's just as good as he is, or even sometimes even better. And so therefore, you tend to get better employees that way.
We have a lot of nepotism in Piedmont Airlines, which most airlines did not have. the mother or the father, and in some cases the mother and father both worked for Piedmont. We knew those two people and they were good people. Your chances are better than 50-50 that the kids are going to be pretty good employees too, instead of going out and hiring somebody brand new off the street that you knew nothing about other than what was on an employment application. And I am still convinced today that that was really the backbone of Piedmont Airlines, which made it a family, because it literally was a family.
The Piedmont family worked closely with each other day in and day out, serving the passengers of the fledgling airline with perseverance, optimism, and enthusiasm. As father of this family, Mr. Davis exhibited those same characteristics as he prepared for the Speedbird's day in court. In late 1949, the Civil Aeronautics Board versus State Airlines was argued before the United States Supreme Court. 2 months later, a decision was handed down. By a 6-2 margin, justices affirmed the right of the CAB to award local service to Piedmont Airlines. The track record of the company, though short, had demonstrated that the Winston-Salem-based airline was indeed capable. In fact, 2 years later, as Mr. Davis applied for a routine extension of its permit to fly as a commercial carrier, the Civil Aeronautics Board rewarded Piedmont Airlines with an unprecedented 7-year certificate.
In a landmark decision in 1952, renewing Piedmont's certificate, the CAB said, and I quote from the official CAB documents, "The record achieved by Piedmont is so outstanding as to merit special recognition. We would reward the carrier for its achievements and thereby offer an incentive to other carriers to strive for comparable results."
Maybe nothing exemplified the Piedmont work ethic better than the efforts of employees to keep wait time during stops to a minimum. Since the early flights had so many landings along the routes, flight and ground crews sprang into action to safely but quickly unload and load the pacemakers for the next leg of the daily journey.
In the DC-3, we had some 3-minute stops, and you would only shut one engine down. It would be the engine on the side where the baggage compartment was. It would be where the side where the step door was to get in for the passengers in and out. And you'd leave one engine idling so it wouldn't produce too much wind. Then you get the passengers off and back on and baggage all loaded and out in 2 to 3 minutes.
Piedmont was great with customer service, and Tom had instilled that in all his employees, that the customer had to come first. On board the airplanes, they did everything they could to try to make the ride comfortable. Early on, they were having poor success with water out of thermoses and iced tea out of thermoses. Frequently, the crews mixed up which was to go in which, and so the water tasted awful. So they started putting Cokes on board the planes instead. And then they started putting in Krispy Kreme donuts. They would fill up with a couple dozen of those on the airplane and hand those out. So they would offer those sort of amenities to the passengers, because otherwise it was a pretty Spartan existence on Piedmont Airlines in those early years. They were flying DC-3s, they were unpressurized, they were flying routes over the mountains, and there was a lot of turbulence. In the summertime, there were thunderstorms. In the wintertime, it could get very cold at altitude.
You know, some people used to laugh at Piedmont and call it a puddle jumper airline, and they did have some pretty strange schedules. If you go back and look at some of their schedules, where you got a flight going from Winston-Salem to Danville to Lynchburg, and then eventually it's going to Washington, D.C. Well, it's going to take you all day to get there, but that's how they built things up. Once they reached a certain level, then they could fly like other airlines.
We had a scheduled flight between Winston-Salem and Greensboro, which was 17 minutes from ramp to ramp. And, you know, it'd take you about 4 or 5 minutes to taxi out, and when you got on the ground, about 4 or 5 minutes to taxi in. And we would make that flight. You were just up and down.
It was quite clear that short-haul air service serving small and medium-sized cities could never be profitable without subsidy support, unless a new modern aircraft more efficient than the DC-3 was available.
Tom Davis and others went to Europe and they looked at different aircraft, and they finally settled on the F-27.
Fairchild was air-conditioned and was pressurized. That would have made a tremendous difference. It was a better performing airplane. We could get a little higher than you could in the DC-3, a little faster.
They were an exciting period for us because they burned a different fuel. They had a different sound to them. It was quite an advancement at that time from the 3, at least we thought so.
The plane did everything they wanted it to do, but there were a lot of quirks to that airplane.
It just didn't turn out to be the right airplane. That was a little bit of a setback, but I think the real breakthrough for Piedmont was in the early 60s when they bought the 17 used Martin 404s from TWA.
By the time it was time for Piedmont to exercise its option to buy some more F-27s, they were costing almost $1 million a piece, and that was too much money. Tom Davis, being the thrifty guy that he was, found a good deal on some used Martin 404s from TWA, and he could buy 17 of those for roughly $400,000 each, and that was a much better bargain in his eyes. And so Piedmont had a limited run with the F-27. They kept them in service for a good long time, but it never became a big plane in the fleet.
The early 1960s proved to be exciting times for the airline. In addition to new planes came new destinations. Atlanta and Baltimore extended the Speedbird route system by 50%. Also, the first female flight attendants were added in 1962. Like stewardesses throughout the airline industry, these new hires at Piedmont had to be under age 32 and meet stringent height and weight restrictions.
It was 5'2" to 5'7". You had to weigh according to your height. It was quite a privilege to be a flight attendant. We were like in a goldfish bowl.
We were probably chosen as